Welcome to the Great War Discussion Group. This will be a talk by Jerry Schmidt, who has been looking into things like what actually happened to people who were heroes during the war, who were significant during the war. And today he's going to look at people who died during the war. So, Jerry, you're going to tell us about some of the stories of some of those who fell during the war. Jerry, go ahead.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, it's my pleasure to bring you the Great War. And of course, you all know that millions died during the war. The question that I was raising for myself when I began this was to take a look at how did people die? And then what happened to their remains and how are they remembered? Very important aspects to make sense, if that can be done, make sense of World War I. What I'm trying to do today is actually profile individuals so we can talk about how they died, what happened to them. And also I want to talk about some units and what happened to these units and of the men that died within them. I also want to talk about some issues. And of course, one of them is the issue that came up at the end of the war as to what is America going to do with its dead? Is America going to bring them home, or are they going to do something else? And there was quite an issue about that. Second thing is to talk about the ill-advised policies that arose at the end. And one of them was to keep white Gold Star mothers and black Gold Star mothers separate when they made their pilgrimages to Europe. Also, which flows with that, is black soldiers were actually assigned to bury and rebury and the dead. That was part of their jobs, and for the labor battalions in particular. And then the last question I want to raise and at least address shortly is why did we have to hold the soldiers during the last 6 hours of the war? Why did we not hold the soldiers during the last 6 hours of the war instead of having them go on the offensive? When you think about it, you might think, well, it wasn't necessary. In 1914, the potential belligerents in Europe believed that although there was no consensus about going to war, it was on the horizon. Many believed a war would be a catastrophe. It would be long, the cost would be high. Western Europe was industrialized. Its people were relatively prosperous, and the nation shared a common culture. They feared that if war came, it would lead to economic dislocation, social upheaval, political revolution, and massive numbers of deaths. And it would take decades, possibly generations, to recover. In fact, many years earlier, Winston Churchill prophesied that a European war would have no winners. He said that war would only end in the ruin of the vanquished and the scarcely less fatal commercial dislocation and exhaustion of the conquerors. Others believe that if war came, it would be short, like several other recent wars. In fact, over by Christmas began to characterize the thoughts of many. They believed the war would be winnable and the cost would be low. Some believed war would be a biological necessity. They equated victory with survival of the fittest. And of course, you've heard in the videos in the museum, Thomas Mann, the German essayist, said war would be a purification, a liberation, and enormous hope. Of course, President Wilson was against war. He considered the leaders of Europe to be politically and morally bankrupt, and he saw himself as a peacemaker who could shape the peace when fighting stopped. Over the course of 1 month after the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, Franz Ferdinand of Austria, the nations of Europe invoked their alliances and followed each other into war. Using antiquated 19th century battle tactics, Men would die in huge numbers on all fronts, from artillery barrages, machine gun and small arms fire, poisonous gas, avalanches, cave-ins, and more than likely other issues that we can't even imagine. Many deaths could be blamed on faulty operations plans and the ignorance and callousness of the commanders. And at sea, German submarines would sink thousands of ships, killing crewmen and passengers. Typically, as one would expect, the combat deaths were sudden and violent. But a few stories also showed that men at war, even those having experienced the most bitter combat, could, under some circumstances, allow their basic human qualities to prevail. For many patriotic and motivated volunteers who rushed to enter the war with hopes of a great and rapid victory, some were ready to die. But many soon believed that only fate could allow them to live through the war. With time, being stuck in the muddy fields, the filthy trenches, and the dangerous shipping lanes, the whole thing took on the aura of hell on earth. But some Americans had an interest in the war, but most of them were pleased to stay out of it. They agreed with Wilson, "It is not our war." Only after the war, when the veterans, poets, and writers from both sides told their stories, would they know how insane this had become. Ultimately, 65 million men were mobilized between 1914 and 1918 for the Great War. And you can see Russia, 12 million, British Empire, almost 9 million, France, almost 8.5 million, Germany, 11 million, et cetera. Just insanity. After early successes, all of the initial war plans quickly failed. The Schlieffen Plan, Russia's plan for mobilization, the French Plan 17, and of course, Austria-Hungary, which had to really depend on the faithful support of the Germans to survive. Initially, Germans reported their combat successes to the public and published lists of names of their combat dead in local newspapers. But as the numbers increased, the list drew too much negative attention, and the practice became forbidden. Then, to get into some of the individuals that were affected by all of this, we go to John Parr. He lied about his age and joined the British Army in 1911 at the age of 14. He saw the Army life as an improvement over his life as a civilian. At the age of 17, he was deployed to the continent with one of the first British Expeditionary Forces units. As a forward scout, he rode his bicycle ahead of the infantry to locate and identify the enemy. Then he returned to give his report. On August 21st or 23rd, 1914, possibly during the Battle of the Mons, he was killed. His body was buried in a battlefield grave, probably by the Germans, after they defeated the British at Mons. Although the circumstances of his death are not clear, he was considered the first soldier to die in combat. Coincidentally, Parr's grave now faces a marker for a George Ellison, who died in November 11, 1918, during the British action to retake Mons from the Germans. Ellison was considered the last British soldier to be killed, and they were among 1,600 British casualties at Mons. From the end of 1914, a military stalemate existed and remained on both fronts for the next 3 years. Battles on the Western Front concentrated along a 450-mile trench line that stretched from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. Fighting on the Eastern Front would stretch across a wide expanse from the Baltic Sea in the north to Central Europe. Unlike the use of artillery bombardments and relatively short trench raids on the Western Front, the armies on the East used broad movements in advance to advance their positions, but neither side was able to deliver knockout blows. With the belligerents slugging it out in the trenches on the Western Front, Winston Churchill, the British Undersecretary of the Navy, insisted on establishing a new front in Turkey to reopen the Dardanelles. Churchill acknowledged the price for taking Gallipoli could be high, but Turkey would be out of the war. Churchill was only half right. In March 1915, a combined British and French fleet of 18 ships approached the entrance to the Dardanelles. Encouraged by what he saw around him, one Allied officer professed, "No human power could possibly withstand such an array of might and power." However, British intelligence grossly underestimated the ability of the Turks to defend themselves with artillery and sea mines. The invasion resulted in the loss of 700 sailors, several Allied ships, and of course, a humiliating withdrawal. Then, through amphibious landings on Gallipoli's beaches, the British and the French established small bridgeheads to fight the Turks who operated from the heights. Again, the losses were enormous. After the Allied landing at Anzac Cove, the Allies and the Turks agreed to a one-day truce simply to clean the battleground. A surgeon for New Zealand and a member of the Allied burial party wrote, "The Turkish dead lay so thick that it was almost impossible to pass without treading on their bodies. Huge holes created by artillery were surrounded by circles of corpses blown to pieces. Everywhere one looked lay dead, swollen, black, hideous, and overall a nauseating stench that nearly made one vomit." A New Zealander remembered, "No body handled on that day was buried more than 6 or 8 inches underground." As the British were withdrawing, one of the officers that was aboard ship stated, "To desert our fallen comrades and sneak away in the dark without a fight is a revolting thing, and the thought of it nauseates me." To profile some of those that lost their lives in Gallipoli, John Simpson was an Australian stretcher bearer who was responsible for recovering wounded men from the battlefield. Somehow he was able to secure a donkey to help him do his job in what was called Shrapnel Valley. During the weeks of exposing himself to Turkish fire from above, he earned the admiration of everybody for his courage and devotion to duty. But on a day in May 1915, he was struck by a bullet from a machine gun and died in the field. He was buried there in Gallipoli. He was nominated for a Medal of Valor, but his commander stated he's doing his job, nothing more than the other stretcher bearers did. New Zealand, of course, was looking for the opportunity to establish itself as an independent nation, and they developed a division of soldiers to enter the war. At the outset of their involvement, New Zealand began forming a division to be part of the British forces. After their employment in Gallipoli, 2,800 members were killed. The division then was redeployed to the Western Front, where it was involved in the Somme offensive, and another 2,000 men were killed. After that, the division fought at Messines, with 700 additional deaths, and Passchendaele at 850. In total, nearly 17,000 men from New Zealand were killed during the war. A Lieutenant Charles Doughty Wiley was a former British consul to the Ottoman Empire and a Red Cross worker during the Second Balkan War. He had a deep love for the Turkish people, yet he had great responsibility to defend Britain, his mother country. Accordingly, he chose to lead his British forces in the attack on the fort at Sed El Bahr above V Beach in Gallipoli, carrying only a walking stick. He was killed during the attack. The British awarded him the Victoria Cross. Recognizing him for his support for the operations during the Second Balkan War, the Turks awarded him their Order of Medjidia and buried him in the only solitary grave in Gallipoli, where he remains. The Allies suffered a total of over 130,000 casualties and 46,000 deaths. The Turks' losses were nearly twice as many. The Turks lost 5,000 men alone during their third attempt to drive the Allies from the narrow hold on Anzac Cove. When finally evacuating from Gallipoli at night through camouflage, many Allied survivors expressed their strong sense of loyalty to their fallen comrades. The Germans regarded Verdun as an important target for several reasons. For one, they knew the loss of a storied citadel would cause an enormous blow to the French morale. But instead of attempting a breakthrough, the Germans decided on a battle of annihilation to bleed France white. They believed that to save Verdun, the French would exhaust themselves by continually throwing in reserves to replace their dead and wounded. To the French, Verdun had to be held at all cost, and they had their own mantra, which was, "They shall not pass." But France held on. By December, the French counterattacks on German positions regained all the ground France had lost since February. The German plan failed, and the human costs were enormous. France had about 380,000 casualties and 160,000 deaths. Germany had about 340,000 casualties and 140,000 deaths. And then never too old to serve heroically, we talk about a Lieutenant Colonel Emile Driant. And if you think about it, when you go up to Exhibit Hall, he's on the Panthéon de la Guerre up there. You'll recognize his face. As a former French officer for 60 years old, Driant rejoined the French military at the outset of the war. He was placed in command of defenses at Verdun. He had often protested to his commanders that he had neither the manpower nor the equipment to stop a major German attack. On the day the Germans began bombarding Verdun, he effectively directed French counterfire from the roof of his command post. The next day, however, he and his survivors were able to delay the German advance, but Driant had stopped to aid a wounded soldier, and he was shot through the temple and killed. What's interesting is that he became the first French soldier killed at Verdun and his first hero. And also recognized by the Germans, he was buried initially by the Germans, who also wrote to his widow via Switzerland to assure her that he had been accorded full military honors. He was reinterred by the French where he fell, and a memorial now stands there in his honor and also to the honor of his men. We all know the Somme and what happened there. The British and the French decided on a joint operation at the Somme to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. They began their assault with millions of rounds of artillery over the course of 1 week. However, they had too few artillery pieces for the size of the area being bombarded. Then many of the rounds were duds, and the shrapnel rounds they used exploded above ground and had little effect on barbed wire entanglements and earthworks used to protect the German troops. Expecting a walkover after the bombardment, the British troops suffered the worst single day in British military history, with 57,000 casualties and 19,000 killed. A German machine gunner stated that when the British crowded through the narrow openings in the wire of no man's land, he did not have to aim. He just pointed his machine gun to fire and killed them in groups. By the time the campaign ended, the Germans suffered about 650,000 casualties at a cost of 615,000 casualties and over 400,000 of them British. The Allies moved their lines forward approximately 6 miles, the distance a fit man can run in an hour. On the Eastern Front, in the mid-1916, the Russian Brusilov offensive began with the intention of reducing pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians in northern Italy, and possibly forcing Austria-Hungary out of the war. By its end in September, it had met some of its objectives, but it became the most lethal offensive of the war. The Russians and the Austro-Hungarians each had from 500,000 to 1 million casualties, and the Germans possibly had as many as 350. One of the individuals that fought on the German side was a German captain, Martin von Raumer. He was leading his company in an attack on a Russian position on the Eastern Front. He was killed about 100 yards from his objective. A simple memorial service was held the next evening in a nearby forest. Then his body was taken about 35 miles to the rear for a burial in a cemetery, awaiting his mother's decision about returning his remains to his Silesian home. Such was impossible for most of the dead who were buried exactly where they fell. The Battle of the Jutland. After the Battle of Dogger Bank in January 1915, the Germans decided to focus their naval strategy on the use of submarines to disrupt and destroy Allied shipping. But a year later, Admiral Scheer, the German High Seas commander, had a change of heart and ordered his surface fleet of 103 ships out of German ports to attack Allied shipping interests in the north and possibly punch a hole in the British blockade. However, British intelligence read the German communications and alerted its grand fleet of 151 ships. The fleets met mid-afternoon in May 31st, 1916. By evening, the British had executed a maneuver that could have resulted in the destruction of the German high seas fleet. However, during the night, the Germans made a pre-planned withdrawal and escaped the trap. In total, the Germans lost 11 ships and suffered 3,000 casualties, while the British lost 14 ships and had nearly 6,800 casualties. Included among those that went down that went down during the battle fight, Nicholas Eden. He was age 16 years old. Was in charge of the gun turret on the Indefatigable battle cruiser in the British fleet. It was hit by German shells, and Nicholas went down with his ship. Interestingly, his brother, Anthony Eden, who later would become British Prime Minister, learned of Nicholas's death while serving in the trenches on the Western Front. Their brother, Lieutenant John Eden, a member of the 12th Lancers, was killed in October 1914 while he was serving in Belgium. Getting into the U-boat campaign, the Germans started with a fleet of 29 submarines in 1914. They added more than 300 during the war and had over 200 under construction when the war ended. At their height in October 1917, they had 170 U-boats at sea to carry out their unrestricted submarine warfare campaign. During the course of the war, they sank 5,000 ships and 13 million gross tons of cargo. The largest single loss of life occurred when the Germans sank the Italian SS Principe Umberto in June of 1916, with a total loss of nearly 2,000 lives. In total, during the war, the Germans lost 178 of their own U-boats and 5,000 seamen. And of course, we all know the story of the Lusitania. On May 7th, 1915, the RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by German submarine U-20 off the Irish coast. The ship sank in 18 minutes. Nearly 2,000 people were aboard. Of them, nearly 1,200 were killed, including 128 Americans. To Americans, the sinking of the Lusitania became the most important reason for favoring Allies in the war. But President Wilson kept his decision to not enter the war, although he warned the Germans that the incident could change America's idea about entering the war. He insisted on the Germans stopping unrestricted submarine warfare. Then we moved to the Italian front, 1915 through 18. Italy entered the war on the Allied side in 1915 because they believed the Allies would treat them better when the war was won than the Central Powers would. The war in Italy primarily was between Italy and Austria-Hungarian troops. They fought battles on the plains and in the mountains in the north and the east. But for the men who fought in the mountains, their lives were unlike any others during the war. To an Italian commander, scaling the heights was not supposed to be a problem. He said, where a donkey can go, a man can go. Where a man can go, he can take a cannon. The mountain troops met the challenge. They scaled sheer mountain walls and dug their trenches and tunnels through solid ice. But then you look at the Austrian mountain troops, considering the environments in which they were fighting, an Austrian officer said, the mountains in winter are more dangerous than the Italians. During December 1916, about 200,000 tons of snow, rock, and ice roared down the mountainside and buried an Austrian barrack. About 200 soldiers were pulled to safety, but 300 died. By the end of the month, over 9,000 Austrians and Italians had died from avalanches. Over 30 months, the Italians and Austro-Hungarians fought 12 battles along the Isonzo River in eastern Italy. In the 12th battle, the German troops assisted the Austrians in breaking out of the Isonzo by using phosgene gas. This allowed the Austrians to move all the way to the Piave River. As the Austrians moved forward, they witnessed the effects of the German gas on the Italian troops. An Austrian soldier wrote, "We had seen many terrible things, but what presented itself to us on this occasion surpassed every preceding spectacle and will stay in my memory forever. There, in roomy and well-supplied shelters and caverns, were frozen some 800 men, all dead. A few, fleeing together, had fallen on the floor face down, but the majority were bunched up near the walls of the shelters, rifles between their knees, uniform and weapons intact. In a sort of barrack, we found another 40 bodies. They must have died without even knowing what was happening." In 1917, back on the Western Front, the Allies decided on a joint operation to force the Germans out of their defenses. The main offensive would be directed at by the French at the Chemin de Dam Ridge. And of course, we know General Nivelle. He estimated that the French would experience a total of about 10,000 casualties. But because of little success and exceedingly high casualties again, the French troops began to mutiny. They were weary of suicidal attacks, no rest or home leave, and strict punishments for violations. They decided they would defend their positions, but they would not go on the attack. By the time the battle was stopped, the French had about 30,000 killed in action, with over 180,000 casualties. The Germans lost approximately the same number. As an element of the attack on the Chemin de Dam, the French wanted to stop the Germans from using a 300-yard-long Winterberg tunnel to supply the first line of German trenches on the southern slope. The French launched an observation balloon to direct artillery, and they hit the north entrance of the tunnel. The initial explosions caused secondary explosions from German ammunition stored in the tunnel and sent acrid fumes through the tunnel that was occupied by 270 men. Another artillery round closed the exit. One of the three Germans who was rescued said, "Everybody was calling for water, but it was in vain. Some raved about rescue, others for water. One comrade lay on the ground next to me and croaked with a breaking voice for someone to load a pistol for him." Aircraft were new to the military at the outset of the war. Initially, they were used for reconnaissance. Pilots and engineers learned from experience, which led to rapid technological improvements in fighters, bombers, and trench strafers. But with the expansion of their roles came increased losses. Approximately 10,000 airplanes were lost during the combat by the British, French, and the Germans. Over 15,000 airmen were killed, and total casualties numbered over 40,000. Still as deadly as the operations could be, the fighter pilots were the darlings of the air, and some of them became popular heroes. Everyone recognizes the Red Baron. He's credited with 80 confirmed kills, and he was operating in the Somme River area on April 21st, 1918, when he pursued a British airman at a low level into British territory. He was fired at from the ground and from the air. He was hit, and although his wound would be fatal, he was able to land his airplane. Members of the Australian Flying Corps recovered his body and buried it in a cemetery in a village near Amiens. Considering him a gallant and worthy foe, 6 of the officers of the 3rd Squadron served as pallbearers for his funeral, and a guard of honor from the squadron's other ranks filed a salute. Allied squadrons stationed nearby presented memorial wreaths. After the war, the Germans reinterred his remains in a family plot in Wiesbaden in Germany. Back home, President Wilson had asked the American people to be neutral in thought and action, but some individual Americans believed it was the time for them to become part of destiny, and they joined the Allies long before America got involved. Some had familiar relationships with Allied partners. Many others joined for glory and adventure. Winston Churchill again encouraged American enlistments. He believed nothing will bring American sympathy along with us so much as American bloodshed in the field. One of those was a Dr. Blendon Hutchison. Dr. Hutchison was a graduate of the Northwestern University Medical School. In 15, he renounced his American citizenship to join the Canadian Army as a medical officer. After the war, he had many memories of his work in combat situations, including some that were particularly disturbing. In one, the unit was being hit by artillery barrage, and Hutchison came upon a soldier whose ghastly wound would be fatal in a short time. In great pain and knowing there was no hope, the soldier pleaded with Hutchison to shoot him. In another artillery barrage, many men were killed. One of the men had been carrying phosphorus smoke bombs, which had ignited his clothing. Since the bombardment continued, Dr. Hutchison took evasive action. When he was able to return to the body, he found it was totally incinerated. Dr. Hutchison was awarded the British Victory Cross for his work. After the war, he reclaimed his American citizenship. Of course, ambulance drivers. Shortly after the start of the war, the American hospital in Paris opened a military hospital to accommodate the large number of wounded from the battlefields. In April 1915, they negotiated an agreement to have some of their ambulance drivers serve closer to the front lines. They later became known as the American Field Service. A driver recalled being deeply moved by what he saw as he drove his ambulance. He wrote, "Every few rods scattered about the fields, small wooden crosses and little red, white, and blue flags mark the spots where lie the bodies of boys and men who gave their lives in these terrible days. 20, 30, 40 men had been buried together." Ultimately, about 2,500 drivers evacuated more than 400,000 casualties during the war. About 100 drivers died of pneumonia, motor and airplane accidents, air raids, and enemy fire. And of the 620,000 men in the Canadian Army, over 35,000 were Americans. Of the 2,700 Americans who died during their service with the Canadians, 2,200 died overseas. Irvin Hart was a volunteer from Weeping Water, Nebraska, probably a place you've all visited. He enlisted in Windsor, Ontario in March of 1916. He was killed in April 1917 while carrying a man from the frontline trenches during the Canada's victorious battle at Vimy Ridge. He was reported missing, presumed dead, and his name was inscribed on the Vimy Memorial at Pas-de-Calais. In 1914, foreigners living in France numbered in the tens of thousands. Concerned about the approaching war, a Paris paper published an appeal by 2 foreign citizens asking other foreigners to help defend France. In early August 1914, along with thousands of others, 43 Americans volunteered. Alan Seeger, who was a Harvard graduate and a poet, lived in Paris where his creative juices flowed best. When the war started, he joined the French Foreign Legion, but he did not abandon his writing. Given his situation, he wrote the poem that addressed his potential destiny. And I've selectively picked through the poem, but it goes, I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade on some scarred slope of battered hill. And I, to my pledge, am true. I shall not fail that rendezvous. Sigurd did not fail his rendezvous. He died along with 19,000 other British soldiers on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Reportedly, his remains rest with other dead in ossuary number 1 of the French National Cemetery in Lyon. Victor Chapman was an American expatriate in France when the war started. He joined the French Foreign Legion in August 1914, and he went to flight school and became a member of the French Army's Air Arm and eventually the Lafayette Escadrille. In June 1916, he was flying in the Verdun area when he was attacked by 4 German airplanes and wounded. While still in recovery, he loaded his airplane to take oranges to a friend who was recovering at another location. Again, he was attacked and shot down. This time he died and became the first American aviator to be killed during the war. Unfortunately, his remains were not clearly identified, and he is memorialized in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. He was awarded the French military Médaille Militaire and the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms. 49 other Americans who flew for the French also died in combat or training accidents. Harry Butters was the son of a prominent San Francisco industrialist. He inherited his father's wealth in 1902 and could have had a life of ease. Having been raised for a time in England, he rallied to the British when the war broke out in 1914. Through his old school connections, he was commissioned in the Royal Artillery in 1915. Butters wrote to his family saying, "This I firmly believe, that if I live through it to spend a useful lifetime with you, that never will I have the opportunity to gain so much honorable advancement for my own soul." His unit was deployed to the Western Front in September 1915, where he participated in the ill-fated Battle of Loos. In 16, by chance, he even met and dined with Winston Churchill, who by then was a battalion commander after leaving his post of Undersecretary of the Navy because of the Gallipoli disaster. In August 1916, Butters' unit was employed at the Somme when his artillery piece took a direct hit. He and all the members of his battery were killed. According to his expressed wish to a chaplain, his gravestone gives his name and the simple phrase, "an American citizen." In February 1917, the Germans believed the time was right to force the issue and win the war. Russia was embroiled in its own civil war, and the Americans were still holding to their neutrality. Consequently, Germany restarted its unrestricted submarine warfare and attempted to entice the Mexican government to declare war on the United States and get Japan to change sides. Wilson decided enough was enough. America declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. In his scholarly address to the American Congress and people, Wilson said, "The recent acts of Germany were nothing less than war on America. Right is more precious than peace. The world must be made safe for democracy." When Wilson rode back to the White House, the people lining Pennsylvania Avenue cheered and waved their hats and handkerchiefs. But Wilson felt disheartened and said, "Think about what they are applauding. My message today was a message of death for our young men." In effect, Wilson was invoking the last stanza of John McCrae's iconic poem, In Flanders Fields. "Take up the quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." Wilson then appointed General Pershing commander of the American Expeditionary Forces and by June 5th, 1917, over 9 million men between ages of 21 and 31 had registered for the American draft. Mobilization and deployment were underway. Shortly thereafter, on June 14th, Pershing and his undersized staff sailed on the RMS Baltic to Europe. Although troop deployments were supposed to be classified, the Chicago Tribune quickly reported, Pershing's casualty list will be the first rap on the hand of fate on the American door. The fate will come later with equal foot to the door of the rich and the door of the poor. Obviously, he's saying no one would be exempt. Frustrated with the slowness of the troop arrivals in Europe, Pershing angrily demanded that other than troops, the only items to be shipped be related to the AEF's combat mission. Among the items to be excluded were bath bricks, bookcases, bathtubs, cuspidors, all items that could be purchased locally if needed. He also declined proposals to ship coffins to Europe and denied the assistance of private embalmers. Although the numbers of ships and men were increasing in late 1917, the arriving combat troops were not yet trained or equipped to serve at the front. However, Germans knew they were there and they wanted to welcome the Americans. Unfortunately, the introduction to war would be sudden. It would be deadly in a variety of ways to the naive Americans. Base Hospital Number 5 was among the 6 hospital groups deployed to France in May of 1917. Lieutenant William Fitzsimmons, a doctor from Kansas City and an alumnus of the University of Kansas, was assigned to the hospital. He wrote his mother saying, "Death doesn't seem as dreadful to me as failure to do whatever job you were given to do." On September 4th, he wrote, "We are startled by the bursting in rapid succession of 4 bombs, which produced a casualty list of 14 killed and 35 wounded. Needless to say, we were quite busy with the wounds for several hours." That evening at 10:30, Fitzsimmons was in his tent when he heard an exchange of bombs and anti-aircraft guns in the distance. He exited his tent and asked if everything was all right. Before he received an answer, more daisy-cutting bombs hit in rapid succession. The first landed at Fitz's feet and the second about 18 inches away, killing him instantly. The record of his injuries described them as multiple shrapnel wounds. Another account said he was blown to pieces. 3 privates were also killed, and 9 other staff members were wounded, including another doctor and a nurse. Dr. Fitzsimmons would become the first officer to die in the AEF. His remains were interred in the officer section of the military cemetery in Étampes in France and permanently interred in the Somme. News reached Fitzsimmons' family long before official notice from the War Department could be delivered. Assuming the family knew Fitz's death, a reporter of the Kansas City Star knocked at Mrs. Fitzsimmons' door and asked for a photograph and any recent letters from him. Fitz's brother was getting a haircut when a friend asked if he had heard about his brother. Reacting to circumstances of Fitzsimmons' death, former President Theodore Roosevelt wrote a very critical editorial note about America's lack of preparedness and added, "We have not in France a single man on the fighting front, and the first American killed was a doctor." Shortly after Fitz's death, the AEF began an arrangement with the British and the French to introduce American troops to combat environment in quiet areas. I use quiet in quotes, where it was unlikely they would become involved too soon in firefights and enemy raids. To get his introduction to the quiet areas, the 1st Division was associated with the French 18th Division in the Somerville section of Lorraine. On November 2nd, 1917, the 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st, relieved the 1st Battalion in the Barthélemont area in France. The 1st Platoon of Company F was assigned the front positions facing the enemy about 500 yards away. Corporal James Gresham, a veteran of the Mexican border, replaced another corporal who had frozen feet. He was in charge of members of two companies. He was to be replaced later by a Sergeant William Hastings. Private Thomas Enright, another veteran of the Mexican border, and Private Merle Hay, an enlistee, were posted as sentries. That evening was quiet, except for occasional rat-tat-tat. At about 3 a.m., everything changed. The Germans turned loose with an artillery barrage for about 3/4 of an hour that prevented support troops from moving forward in the defense of Company F. Then over 200 Austrian stormtroopers penetrated the wire under cover of fire. When the barrage lifted, they were on top of the Americans. Gresham was in his dugout entrance when a man in an American uniform ran up and asked him, "Who are you?" Gresham reported, "An American, don't shoot." The man replied, "You're the one I'm looking for." And he shot Gresham through the eye and cut his throat. Sergeant Stallings was behind Gresham, but before he could react, he was clubbed and knocked down. Another raider approached Hay, who also mistook him for an American. He shot Hay through the head. When the 1st Battalion was able to come to the aid of the 2nd Battalion, it was too late. The raid lasted only 15 minutes. The Germans departed, taking with them their wounded, 12 American prisoners, and whatever American equipment they could carry. When Enright's body was found on top of the parapet after daylight, the survivors learned his throat had been cut from ear to ear, his chest was ripped open, and he had 12 bayonet wounds in his body. In addition to the 3 killed, the Americans had 6 wounded. The following morning, members of Company F carried their 3 dead brothers to the rear and buried them in wooden caskets in graves 1, 2, 3 in the French military cemetery in that area. One of the members of Company F later wrote, "Daybreak on November 3rd brought them to the reality of the horror and the cruelty of the work they had to do, and changed them from callow youths to grim and silent men with a lust for revenge." Later, Pershing came. He inspected the enemy line through a trench periscope and then, with tears in his eyes, visited the 3 graves. Upon his return to Chaumont, Pershing dictated an order that the war shall be won without delay. He wrote that all officers need to meet the challenge, and he threatened that if they were not up to the job, they could return to the United States on their own or request to be sent back. The Associated Press reported the raid very cryptically, but the German press made a joke of the incident by writing, "It is our good fortune that we are equipped to receive and entertain numerous guests, and that we shall be able to provide quarters for those gentlemen. However, we cannot promise them donuts and jam, and to this extent, they will be obliged to recede from their former standard of living." Tom Enright's family learned of the death when it received a pro forma Western Union telegram from the War Department, which unaffectionately stated, "Deep regret to inform you that Private Thomas Enright reported killed in action, with signed McCain, Adjutant General." The Hay family learned of Merle's death on November 5th via a telephone call from a newspaper man from Omaha. The official announcement from the War Department arrived the same day with the same pro forma announcement. Similarly, Gresham's family learned of James's death from a local newspaper woman. When asked about her feelings, Gresham's mother replied, "It's awful hard to have him gone. God help me to endure. Yes, he is my hero, and for his sake I ought to be brave, but I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother." To take advantage of the emotion surrounding the deaths of the first 3, a poster was designed with their images and an inscription, "Give till it hurts. They gave till they died." It was used to advertise Red Cross War Week fundraiser. The poster helped the Red Cross raise $1 million in 1 week. By the end of May 1918, 19 American divisions were in Europe. The first division had been in theater for 11 months, and Pershing decided to prove they could successfully go on the offensive under American command. At the time, the first was deployed near Cantigny along a salient Germans had established at the start of their spring offensive in 1918. The American attack began in the early morning with an Allied barrage on the Germans defending the town of Cantigny. Then the 28th Infantry Regiment followed French tanks to drive the Germans from the village, but immediately braced themselves for an inevitable counterattack. For the next 3 days, without artillery support, the Americans held their positions until under heavy German barrages. It was a great victory for the Americans and the Allies, who were depending on them to hold their own. However, losses were heavy, with the 28 suffering 320 deaths among 1,600 casualties. The German losses were essentially the same. Now, Joyce Kilmer, a family man and a poet, enlisted in New York's National Guard, the Fighting 69th, as they were called at that time. He was widely known for his poem named Trees, and I'm sure you've all heard about it. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. In it, he described the perception that art created by humans could not replicate the beauty achieved in nature. While serving the 165th of the 42nd Division, he wrote another notable poem called Rouge Bouquet. It recounted a day in a relatively quiet area when German artillery buried 21 men of his unit, killing 19, of which were entombed. After switching to a position in the regimental intelligence unit, Kilmer constantly volunteered for hazardous duty. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Now I'm doing the work I love, the work you may be proud of. None of the drudgery of soldiering, but a double share of glory and thrills." During the Second Battle of the Marne, Kilmer led a scouting party to find a German machine gun. On July 30, 1918, his colleagues found him with a bullet through his head. The French awarded Kilmer the Croix de Guerre with a palm, and he was buried in the American cemetery near the Aisne, then permanently moved to the Aisne American Cemetery. As evidence that the prominent and the rich also served, all four of former President Theodore Roosevelt's sons served during the war. On July 14th, 1918, Quentin Roosevelt and others in the 95th Aero Squadron were assigned to escort observation planes in the Second Battle of the Marne. After completing their mission, they were jumped by at least 7 German planes. Roosevelt decided to engage 3 German aircraft. He was hit and his airplane turned over and plunged to the ground just north of the Marne. Finding documents on him, the Germans were shocked to learn they had killed Quentin Roosevelt, son of the former president. Out of respect, the Germans buried Roosevelt the next day in an isolated grave where he fell. The French awarded him the Croix de Guerre with palm. Condolences arrived at the family from around the United States, including from President Wilson and General Pershing. Theodore Roosevelt told the War Department he wanted his son's body to rest where it fell. The responsibility for care would be the family's. There it remained until 1955, when it was moved into Normandy American Cemetery to be reinterred next to his brother, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who had died of a heart attack during the landing during D-Day. Then we also move on with the sea. The Jacob Jones was cruising along the coast of England on December 6, 1917, when it was hit by a torpedo from a German submarine, U-53. It sank in 8 minutes. It was the first U.S. destroyer to be sunk by the Germans, but unlike the fate of many doomed ships, the German commander radioed Queenstown in Ireland to give coordinates so the survivors could be rescued. Still, a total of 64 American seamen were lost. And women also answered the service. Here we profile several of the women from several different organizations supporting their war effort. and to include the Army Nurse Corps, the Red Cross, telephone operators, the Hello Girls, and the YMCA. First of all, the Red Cross nurses. The SS Magnolia was among the ships that carried American-based hospitals to Europe. When it was about 250 miles out from New York, its crew held target practice with the 6-inch gun on the aft of the ship. One faulty shell exploded, and the casing flew into a group of nurses and doctors who were observing the practice. 2 volunteer Red Cross nurses assigned to Base Hospital number 12, there was Clara Ayers and Helen Wood, were killed by the projectile, and another nurse was critically injured. Ayers and Wood would become the first to die following America's first civilians to die following America's entry into the war. Their deaths were listed as accidents. They were referred to as reserve nurses of the American Nurse Corps. Another U.S. ship was dispatched to return their bodies so they could be sent to their homes for burial. With their demise, Woods joined 2 of her brothers in death. Her brother William was with the 5th Royal Scots. He was killed in 1915 in Gallipoli, and her brother Johnson died of wounds in a hospital in the Western Front. She had said if her brothers could risk their lives in Britain, she could risk hers for America. Then profiling Army Nurse Corps. By war's end, over 10,000 Army Corps nurses had served overseas. None were killed, but 272 died of disease, and they were buried with military honors. Then YMCA workers. On March 27th, 1918, German military artillery bombarded the town of St. Menehould near the front line. A shell destroyed the building in which Marion Crandall, a YMCA worker, had taken refuge. She became the first American woman to be killed while in service. Her burial card gave no death cause for her death. She was buried in the hospital cemetery there, but later her remains were moved to the Meuse Argonne. And the Hello Girls. General Pershing and his commanders needed telephone operators who spoke English and French to serve as translators. Inez Crittenden was one of the 233 Hello Girls who were hired for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. In the final days of the war, Inez became bedridden with pneumonia and died on November 11, 1918. She was buried in the Surennes American Cemetery in Paris. She was one of the 350 Hello Girls and Army nurses who died while in service during the war. Over 100 of them died overseas, mostly from disease. After the war, the Army decided the Hello Girls were not soldiers, but instead served as civilians. It took another 65 years for them to be recognized for their military service. Finally, it's time to bury the dead. From the start of the war, combatants died in many areas and from the multitude of causes. The conditions and timing of their demise often determine the fate of their remains. If they died near a field or a base hospital, a cemetery was probably available to hold the bodies in marked graves, and they might be buried in a casket made of wood. Those who died near a French village often were buried in a local cemetery. But if death occurred from sniper fire in the trenches or during the evacuation of wounded, the bodies most likely would be buried near the battle line. If they were killed while attacking, many bodies were not recoverable immediately. Follow-on troops buried them nearby when possible. The bodies of men hit by artillery strikes often were exploded with little or nothing left to bury. Burial at sea. Given the influenza pandemic in 1918, it was not possible to prevent the virus from spreading among the men and women being deployed to Europe, and many became sick and died during their days at sea. A sailor aboard the SS Wilhelmina watched as 15 bodies slid one by one from a platform into the sea from the SS Grant, which was streaming alongside. He said, "I confess I was in tears, and there was tightening around my throat. It was death, death in one of the worst forms, to be consigned nameless to the sea. Overall, tens of thousands of men and women died of virus and its related illnesses while they served. Under any condition, efforts were made to identify the remains of every dead soldier. If the men were not wearing identification discs and members of their units could not identify them, possibly the objects in their pockets could help. If the burial parties found no identifying items, they might place what they found on the surface of the grave with the hopes that somebody later would recognize the objects and identify the body. During the battle, the burial parties did what conditions allowed. They wrapped the bodies in blankets if they were available. Given time pressures, the bodies might be covered with as little as 1 foot of soil. If there were many dead, but little time to attend to them, they might be buried in mass graves before the troops moved on. In 1915 in Gallipoli, the dead Turkish soldiers were permanently buried where they fell in conformance with Muslim tradition. But for the previously unrecovered Allied soldiers there, the bodies remained exposed where they fell until the armistice between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire was signed in October of 1918. Then the remains were collected and buried in Commonwealth cemeteries on the peninsula. In 1917, with America involved in the war, it was time to review America's regulations to identify what was to be done with the deceased and who was responsible. The regulations stated in brief that it was the commanding general's responsibilities to identify the remains of the deceased, establish locations on battlefields where they would be buried, provide a sketch of the burial locations, mark the graves with a suitable headboard with the name, rank, and organization of the deceased, and report the information through proper channels. After the battles on the 3rd Division, after the battles by the 3rd Division at Chateau-Thierry area in June and July, a medical officer in the Services of Supply wrote to the AEF chief surgeon about the appalling sight of swollen, decomposed, and unsanitary bodies of men and horses laying on the battlefield for days. He recommended against having the combat troops involved in burying the dead. He believed the men needed rest, and burying the dead lowered their morale. As a result, the U.S. 1st Army Corps assigned individual companies of the 813th, 815th, and 816th Pioneer Infantry Regiments, African-American troops, to follow each division as closely as possible to bury the dead men and horses. Chaplains also were there, and they exhibited great courage under fire, attempting to rescue wounded and administer last rites. They were responsible for identifying the dead and assisting with burials. They especially attempted to be with the soldiers when they were near death. A Catholic priest wrote in his memoirs that all the men seemed to deal with their deaths in the same way. They expressed sorrow for their failings, and they asked to be forgiven. He wrote, "I never yet found a mortally wounded soldier of any denomination who disdained my help." Chaplains also were charged with collecting personal belongings. If a body was identified, objects found with the body would be returned to the family. Lieutenant Fitzsimmons' mother received these items, including his personal calling cards and a leather belt, both of which had shrapnel tears in them. 23 U.S. chaplains died during the war. And you can imagine how excited Mrs. Fitzsimmons was when she saw these objects. The U.S. Graves Registration Service was expanded, and their service was responsible for relocating and marking graves, remaking and relocating hastily dug graves, and completing a burial card for each deceased soldier to assure proper identification. The burial card would show the deceased name, date of death, rank and name of the unit, exact location of grave, and the family's emergency contact. And then the 29th Engineer Battalion created survey maps and field drawings to show locations of scattered and isolated graves. The plats also showed surrounding landmarks, buildings, and other markers that could be used to identify the location of the burials. With these basic guidelines now confirmed, it was time for the Allies. By the end of the July 18, the German spring offensive was over, and again casualties were high. Both the Allies and the Germans both the casualties were high. Both the Allies and the Germans had over 600,000. Still, no one was willing to make peace. Having stopped the German onslaught, the Allies finally were in position to initiate what would become known as the 100-day offensive, to push the Germans back and take control of the last months of the war. By then, there was nearly 1 million Americans in Europe, and 10,000 more were arriving daily. With successful but costly operations in the Ain, Marne, the Somme, and other offensives, the Americans proved their ability to fight. Finally, at Pershing's insistence, General Foch assigned U.S. forces the responsibility to fight shoulder to shoulder beside the British and French forces, but this time under American command. After pushing the Germans out of the Saint-Mihiel salient, the Americans were assigned a major sector on the line with other Allied forces for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the last major combat battle of the war. Over a 45-day period, the Allied attacks drove the Germans to the peace table. This time, the Americans had 110,000 casualties, the largest number they had experienced in any campaign of the war. The shooting was over. Talking about the soldiers that were involved. Throughout their involvement in the war, the soldiers of the all-black 93rd Division were part of the French order of battle. While fighting in the Champagne-Marne sector, Corporal Freddie Stowers of the 371st Regiment led his unit in an attack on Hill 188. Germans exited their Germans exited their cover as though they were surrendering. Then they opened fire on the exposed Americans. Although mortally wounded, Stowers encouraged his men to continue, and they succeeded in capturing the hill and silencing the enemy. He was buried in an isolated grave in the Ardennes. Stowers' commanding officer recommended him for a Medal of Honor, but the paperwork was not acted upon. Over 70 years later, Stowers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor by President George H.W. Bush. One of the most remembered American events of the war occurred in early October 1918, when the battalion-sized force of various units of the 77th was trapped in a pocket in the by German units. They were able to hold on for 3 days before they finally were rescued. But only 194 of the 550 men in the lost battalion walked out. The other 356 were either killed, wounded, taken prisoner, or were missing in action. Eddie Grant had been a Major League Baseball player and a practicing attorney before enlisting in the U.S. Army. Having attended the summer military training at Plattsburgh, he was commissioned and became a captain in the 307th Infantry of the 77th Division. While involved in action to rescue the lost battalion, Grant was killed by an exploding shell, becoming the first of 8 former major leaguers to be killed or die while serving in the war. He was buried in an isolated grave near Benarville along the Marne River. John Barclay, 4th Infantry, 3rd Division, earned the Medal of Honor for his imaginative and heroic action when he twice stopped German attacks across Hill 253 near Cunel in the Battle of the Argonne. In a letter to his brother, he stated he was not interested in going into the details about what he had done, but he wanted to explain what he saw on the battlefield that day. He wrote, "How would you like to have saw 5,000 men to every 1,000 yards? Just think of looking from our house to the west and then placed this many men in that space. Across the German side, there was twice as bad. Now, my question is, were there 5,000 bodies, or was the sight so shocking that he could not rationally absorb what he saw? Finally, November 11th, the end was in sight. The Germans had agreed to an armistice to end the killing on November 11th. The agreement was signed at 5 in the morning, and it was to go into effect at 11 a.m. However, American and other Allied forces were not held in place until the armistice was signed. Why? Well, there were several reasons. Some feared the enemy would not abide by the armistice. Some other commanders craved a last victory, especially those that had not been heavily involved to that point. And poor communication kept some troops in the dark about what was happening. As a result, about 320 Americans and 2,700 other Allied troops were killed in action during that 6-hour period. First, going with the 81st Division. The 81st arrived in Europe in August of 1918, and they joined the French 7th Army for training in supposedly quiet front, where it experienced over 110 casualties from German trench raids and artillery barrages. On October 19th, it was transferred to the U.S. First Army. On the night of November 10th, its commanders received no official word from the armistice that the armistice would be signed the next morning. Accordingly, at daybreak on November 11th, the 321st went over the top for the first time ever to attack a German trench position. At 10:30 a.m., the 323rd of the 81st began to fight its way through barbed wire entanglements along the German trench line, with some members entering the German trenches and many men killed and pinned down. At 11 o'clock, the firing abruptly stopped. During its short time in combat, the 81st suffered 248 killed and 856 wounded. Henry Gunther was a draftee from Maryland. He was a member of the 313th Infantry of the 79th Division. He arrived in Europe in July 1918 as the company's supply sergeant. He made the mistake of writing his feelings in a letter to a friend, complaining about life in the trenches and urging his friend to avoid going into the military. Military censors read his letter, and he was demoted to private. Then he learned his fiancée decided to break their engagement. Gunther's former gregarious nature became sullen, and to regain his reputation, he began volunteering for dangerous assignments. When he was injured by shrapnel, he insisted on staying with his unit. As the clock approached 11 o'clock on November 11th, on November 11th, Gunther left his position with fixed bayonet to approach 2 German machine gun squads manning a roadblock. His fellow soldiers yelled at him to stop, as did the German soldiers in broken English. Gunther ignored them and kept charging. The Germans fired a burst and struck Gunther. He was dead at 10:59. He was buried in a cemetery near Schmidt, the AEF headquarters, then sent to his family at home. Friends who knew Gunther said he felt he had dishonored his family, and he charged the machine gun nest to regain his stripes. Pershing regarded Gunther as the last American soldier to die. In 1923, Gunther's rank was restored to sergeant, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Now, why did they continue after 5 o'clock? Members of the Congress asked, this was later, members of the Congress asked General Pershing to explain why American troops were not held in position after 5 a.m. on November 11th. Pershing replied, when the subject of the armistice was under discussion, we did not know what the purpose of it was definitely, so that the only thing for us to do, in which I did as commander of the chief of the American forces, and which Marshal Foch did as commander of the Allied forces, was to continue the military operation. Later, Pershing was presented with the stories of 2 units with deadly combat actions after the signing of the armistice. In one, the operations officer in the block Black 167th Field Artillery Brigade of the 92nd explained the 92nd was engaged after 5 o'clock a.m. and made its final charge at 10:30. Pershing repeated he was following Foch's orders and he was not aware of the signing until 6 a.m. that morning. By war's end, an unbelievable 37 million, or over 58% of the 65 million mobilized troops worldwide would be casualties of war. They would be killed in action, die of their wounds or other causes, be wounded but survive, be taken prisoner, or missing in action. Historians estimate that 9 million soldiers gave their lives in the war, which was 14% of the mobilized forces and an average loss of over 6,000 per day. Having been involved in major combat for a much shorter period of time, the United States suffered far fewer losses. Of the 4.7 million men in arms, it had a total of 320,000 casualties, about 6.8%, and 116,000 deaths, about 2.5%. The Army suffered the heaviest losses by far. No writing can possibly convey the shock, horror, and sadness the Americans experienced as their comrades died day by day. Many would never stop reliving the war, and the impacts on the families were enormous. Jay Winter, a historian and author, calculated that the number of women widowed by the war was between 3 and 4 million. Of the 9 million men who died, he estimated about 1/3 of them, on average, left a widow and 2 children. Nearly 1/2 of the French left a widow. Finally, they can start the cleanup. The Graves Registration Service was responsible for gathering more than 76,000 bodies buried in 2,400 large and small cemeteries in isolated locations across Europe, mostly in France. The work to properly exhume them for shipment to their former homes or reinter them in American cemeteries in Europe would be time-consuming and expensive, and of course, ghastly work. Many of their remains were interred and reinterred 3 or 4 times in the process of organizing them for being sent to the United States or being buried in Europe. In the segregated army of the time, the job was assigned to 6,000 Black soldiers from labor battalions. The precedent for using Black soldiers for burial activities was set during the American Civil War, but unwilling to recognize them for their work that they required to do, the Graves Registration Service histories simply referred to the men as cemetery workers or men of the Graves Registration Service. A news correspondent observed the first field operations of the Graves Registration Service in the south of England and reported his impressions. He said the work was carried out in most reverent way. The public was not admitted to the cemetery while the operations were in progress. Each coffin was raised from its resting place by means of ropes. Then the lids were taken off and the corpse, after being disinfected, was carefully wrapped in khaki sheet and lifted into a zinc or copper lead shell. A disc bearing the name of the departed soldier was pinned to the sheet, and the whole was draped with white material. The domed metal lid was then placed on the shell and hermetically sealed down. Each shell was afterwards enclosed in a beautifully polished walnut coffin, which was placed in a stout wooden packing case ready for shipment. Some witnesses were horrified by what they saw as grisly exhumations. An article in the New York Times stated, "Out of the holes were being dragged. What? Boys whom their mothers would recognize? No. Things without shape, at which mothers would collapse." Many obstacles arose in the process of gathering and preparing the dead for the final disposition. There were conflicts between the services, late delivery of caskets, too few trucks and trains to move the bodies, and not enough workers to handle the workload. By the close of 1921, the work temporarily reinterring the remains of about 31,000 dead in Europe and preparing 45,000 for shipment to the United States in other countries was nearly complete. Most had not been embalmed. A British writer observed the casket stacked on the docks in Calais, waiting to be shipped, and wrote, "Americans feel that she is morally superior to Europe. American soil is God's own country, and the rest is comparatively unhallowed." The remains interred overseas were laid to rest in immaculately maintained American cemeteries in England, France, and Belgium. For them, war's purposefulness, rather than its tragedy, was emphasized, as death in battle became a noble sacrifice for the worthy cause. And unlike the burial practice at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., the American Battle Monuments Commission, which managed the American cemeteries overseas, prided itself that burials in Europe were carried out one soldier next to another, regardless of race, rank, or other status. At the start of the involvement in the war, the American government left the public to believe the dead would be returned when the fighting stopped. That had been policy since the turn of the century. However, at the time when the decision was made to bring the dead home, the numbers involved were only in a few thousand. Britain and France only rarely returned bodies of members of their military who died away from their borders. The British had over 700,000 dead, and the French had 1.4 million. Both were concerned that if the United States returned its dead, their people would make the same demand. The British policy was so clear that British poet Rupert Brooke composed a poem to reflect it. In his poem titled "The Soldier," he wrote in part, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's a corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Brooke died of disease aboard a ship en route to Gallipoli. Upon death, his foreign field was a spot on one of the Greek islands in the Mediterranean Sea. The French also envisioned ghoulish trains packed with decayed and unsanitary bodies crisscrossing their countryside. They argued that they had to concentrate on rebuilding and ban the removal of bodies for 3 years. This led the American Congress to ask questions about the cooperation of the French. A representative from Indiana noted, "The French were very anxious to have our boys come over when they were standing with their backs to the wall, gasping for breath. They were perfectly willing to acknowledge their service then, though they are now denying it." Pershing and others in the American military agreed with the British and the French that the dead should remain where they fell. They argued that burying the dead in the battlefield cemeteries with their fallen comrades offered the greatest glory. General Peyton March, who was the Army Chief of Staff, provided another perspective. He said, of the bodies, practically none of them are in a recognizable position. That is, if friends, relatives expect to recognize the remains, it will be quite a shock to them when they see what they are like. The Treaty of Versailles called for France to make land available to the countries that needed space to bury their dead. In May 1919, France gave the cemetery of Sureness outside of Paris to the American government for permanent burial of American dead. Later, they and the Belgians granted whatever land was needed to bury British and American dead. However, they were not in agreement with the Germans, who had to bury many of their dead in mass graves. The families back home worried about their sons and husbands and what had been laid to rest. They were concerned they had been laid to rest with little or no ceremony, and their graves were hastily dug, unmarked and untended. The War Department began receiving letters from families with concerns about what might have happened to their sons and what government was planning to do. Their pain and concern was evident in their questions, and they wanted answers to their questions. Are the bodies embalmed? What kind of caskets are being used? One said, my son sacrificed his life to American call, and now you must as a duty, bring my son back. Another asked, are you sure our son is dead? You made mistakes on 3 others from our area. You said they were dead, but they were in the hospital and recovering. One said, my husband went over in October 1918 and died of pneumonia. He has been dead for a short time. It might still be possible to see his face. Another said, please provide me information on where my son is buried. I am willing to go to France to identify him so there is no mistake. In October 1919, the Adjutant General announced that the War Department would survey each of the fallen soldiers' next of kin. The families could choose to have their remains returned to them or have them buried in the newly created American military cemeteries in Europe. The surveys were sent to the families, and about 64,000 were returned by January 1920. The War Department also followed up later with a shipping inquiry to each respondent to be certain about the intended response. The Adjutant General also asked for patience, that the return of the dead would have to wait at least until most of the surviving troops were returned. Families understood they were being pulled between 2 issues. The shipment of remains from England to the United States began in January of 1920, but the French held out until December 1919, 18 months after the signing of the Versailles Treaty, but only to allow the United States to return its dead from the French zone of the interior. By then, removal of the remains had started for all countries outside of France, except from Siberia and North Russia, due to the ongoing activities of the revolution. Shipments from the zones of the army, that's the combat areas, began in September 1920. But Pershing had to assure the French that the U.S. Army would oversee the process of returning the dead and not allow family members to be involved. Pershing also agreed the unidentified would not be removed. The transportation of the remains to the United States was given to the Army Transportation Service. A member of the Graves Registration Service accompanied the bodies during the passage to the United States, and another member of the service checked all incoming remains in Hoboken. Before the remains arrived in the United States, relatives again were advised not to open the caskets to avoid unnecessary observing the deteriorated and unrecognizable condition of the remains. The bodies of the first 3 combat soldiers killed, Enright, Gresham, and Hay, arrived together in Hoboken from Antwerp in July 2nd of 1921 aboard the U.S. Heaton. The Wheaton refrigerated ship was making its first passage from Europe. Memorial services were held at Piers 2 and 4 in Hoboken on July 10 in honor of the 3 and the other 7,000 who had been returned on the Wheaton and its sister ship, the USAT Psalm. Sergeant William Hastings, a fellow soldier who was with Gresham the night he died, was invited to join General Pershing and other dignitaries in attending the memorial service. Pershing spoke emotionally in honor of the 3. He said, they gave all and they have left us their example. It remains for us with fitting ceremonies, tenderly with flowers in our tears, to lay them to rest on American soil for which they died. Sergeant Hastings then escorted Gresham's remains to Evansville, Indiana for burial. A large granite monument was erected at Hay's gravesite to acknowledge his return. The image shows Uncle Sam wading across the Atlantic Ocean carrying Hay's body. The image shows that it could have been representative of the return of all the dead to the United States. Such ceremonies took place around the United States as the deceased soldiers were returned for reburial in local cemeteries and national cemeteries managed by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Cities and towns around the United States also held ceremonies to honor the soldiers that did not return, either because their bodies remained in Europe or the locations their graves were known but to God. The people of Kansas City honored Lieutenant William Fitzsimmons with a huge memorial that is the centerpiece for acknowledging the service of local individuals in war. In 1920, the U.S. Army renamed its General Hospital in Denver to honor Lieutenant Fitzsimmons. After the initial arrivals of the remains of the dead, the War Department again received letters from families about their experiences, some tragic, some heartwarming. One said, "Our family opened the casket and saw only skeletal remains and a smashed skull. We praise the seeming care taken to deliver our son's remains to the family. We want to thank all for the care given to our son." Another said, "We received the body on March 3rd that was sent to us from for our boy. The marks of identification seemed correct, but the teeth, which stated there were no fillings in them. But we buried it with love and respect for our own boy. He was somebody's boy. I have this respect to make. I have this request to make. If you ever come across another body that tallies exactly with what our boy's description, will you please let me know? Will you let me know?" One said, "I received a body, but it is not my son. It was only a few bones and dirt, someone killed on the battlefield. My son died in a hospital and was buried in the cemetery. If he was sent, he went to someone else. Look it up and let me know." In response to this one, the War Department wrote, "All records check out. No killed in action were buried in that cemetery. Please reconsider your decision. He is yours. If you decide otherwise, we will rebury the body in the National Cemetery if you request it." During the war, families with members in the military displayed a white flag with the blue star for each of the members serving overseas. In the event the member died in service, the blue star was replaced with a gold star. In 1920, several members of Congress introduced legislation to support repatriation of remains to the United States. Fiorello LaGuardia, a representative from Newark and former member of the U.S. Air Service in Italy, also offered legislation to provide transportation to France for the nearest of kin of the soldiers buried overseas. No action was taken for several years on any of the proposed legislation, but Grace Seibold, mother of Lieutenant George Seibold, who was shot down but never recovered, began forming a powerful alliance with other mothers who had lost sons. She stayed involved with veterans and grieving families through a decade. And in 1928, she organized the American Gold Star Mothers in Washington, D.C. Her intent was to convince the federal government to pay for Gold Star mothers to visit their sons' graves in Europe. Under pressure from his wife, President Calvin Coolidge made one of his last decisions as president and allocated $5 million to finance the estimated 11,000 pilgrimages. When Herbert Hoover became president, race was still an obvious issue, and he saw no reason to disturb the status quo. Hoover, like Wilson before him, put politics above basic human rights and decided Jim Crow again will sail to Europe. Trying to rationalize the decision, the White House naively told mothers they would be more comfortable if they traveled with their own kind. Lamely, Hoover suggested that white women be given the choice of passage on 2 ships, since one of them would be the ship carrying black women. His idea quickly died because advisors thought white women might look at the choice as an insult. Another suggestion was to blame the railroads and the steamship lines for compelling the segregation, which was correct for some of the major steamship lines. The basic decision was that white and black women would travel separately. White women would travel on luxury liners and stay in five-star hotels, and Black women would travel on commercial steamers and stay in YMCAs or second-class hotels during their trip. Mothers of military dead were eligible, and as a second thought, wives were added, but they became ineligible if they had remarried. Mothers of women who served in the Army Nurse Corps were eligible, but mothers of women in civilian agencies and men who enlisted in the military of foreign governments were not eligible. An invitation was sent to every eligible woman, and they were asked to respond with a yes, no, or undecided whether they would participate in the pilgrimage to the graves in Europe. Approximately 6,700 women made the pilgrimage from 1930 to 1933. About 1,600 Black women, mothers and wives, were entitled to make the trip. Only 233 accepted the invitation, and fewer than 200 actually sailed. Many could not make the trip because of health or remarriage, but others refused to make the once-in-a-lifetime trip because of the discrimination that they were expected to accept. One wrote, "Dear Sir, I am sorry to say I am canceling my reservation because of discrimination." Another said, "If you as President of the United States refuse to abolish this ruling, we respectfully decline to make the trip to Europe, preferring instead to remain home and retain our honor and self-respect." Once the women left their houses, all reasonable expenses were paid for by the government. But because officials believed that there was a possibility that the pilgrimage would bring out a rage among the mothers and wives over the loss of their sons and husbands, escort officers were warned, "You must consider the temperament of the women and take into consideration with the object of the pilgrimage, which does not tend to calm mental condition." Many of them might become hysterical. I have no doubt upon the least provocation. Washington also wrote to the officer in charge in the operation in Paris, saying it was important to treat the Black mothers with the utmost care and circumspect while in Europe. He wanted no complaints when the women returned. On May 6, 1930, the SS America left Hoboken with 231 white women aboard. 56 of them were foreign-born, primarily from Germany. It was the first of 20 vessels to make the pilgrimage that summer. The SS American Merchant was the first steamship to carry Black women to France. Since some of the dead men were buried at sea, their mothers and wives tossed wreaths from into the Atlantic Ocean in remembrance. With cooperation of the French, normal rules at tourist venues were broken or to better accommodate the women. Restaurants even served American breakfasts. The pilgrims visited Paris and many other cities, and most had a good time beyond any they could have ever experienced on their own. The visits to the graves and the monuments recognizing the missing were solemn and rewarding to the women. The newspapers picked up on the stories and spread the word in the United States. Some of the Black women who initially had decided against making the pilgrimage reacted to the positive news and changed their minds. The decisions of some of the women who had to make a choice follow. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt turned down the opportunity to go. She wrote, "I beg to report that my son left no widow, and it is impossible for me to go." She had already visited the grave earlier on. Mrs. Catherine Fitzsimmons, mother of Lieutenant William Fitzsimmons, sailed on July 9th, 1930, on the SS President Harding. He left his mother $5,400 from 2 life insurance policies he had purchased privately before he entered the service. She visited his permanent grave at the Somme American Cemetery. Mrs. Mary Ross, mother of Lieutenant Cleo Ross, sailed in July 1930 on the SS America. Ross was a member of the 8th Platoon Balloon Company and the only American balloon observer to be killed during the war. He and his pilot were aloft in the balloon on September 26, 1918, the first day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. They were attacked by German aircraft and their balloon burst into flames. Ross waited until his pilot was clear, then he jumped. But burning debris from the balloon fell on his parachute and set it aflame, and he fell to his death. He received a Distinguished Service Cross and was buried in a French cemetery near the Meuse. Mrs. Ross visited his permanent grave at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. Mrs. George Rao, the wife of George Rao, made the pilgrimage in August of 1931 on the America. His mother, Mrs. John Rao, sailed on August 1932 on the President Roosevelt, although an earlier listing showing whether she chose to make the trip indicated she answered no. Rao was a member of the 102nd Infantry 26th Division. He was involved in the deadly German raid at Sykesbury in March of 1918, only to be killed on July 25th in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He was awarded the American Silver Star and the French Croix de Guerre. His wife and mother visited his permanent grave at the Oy American Cemetery. Mrs. Louisa Kimbrough, the mother of American Private Martin Kimbrough, sailed in August 1930 on the SS American Merchant. Martin was a member of the 310th Labor Battalion, and he had died of spinal meningitis in May of 1919. Mrs. Kimbrough visited his permanent grave in the Oy American Cemetery. Mrs. A.I. Amundsen sailed on July 1931 on the President Harding. Her daughter, Esther Amundsen, an Army nurse assigned to the base hospital number 35, had died in October of 1918 of lobar pneumonia. Mrs. Amundsen visited her daughter's permanent grave at the Saint-Mihiel Cemetery. And this is another very interesting story. Mrs. Bessie Strother of Urbana, Ohio, was the mother of African-American Private Henry Strother, a member of the 372nd Infantry of the 93rd Division. He had been killed in action in July 1918 in the Champagne-Marne offensive. In 1930, Mrs. Strother traveled by train to New York City to undertake her pilgrimage to Europe. When she learned Black women were being separated from white women, she backed out. She said, "I'm not going to France." She said she accepted the invitation, not knowing what I know now. I do not want to be a disgrace to my son and to the race. However, possibly because of the favorable reports she read about the pilgrimages, she sailed to Europe in June of 1933 to visit her son's permanent grave in the Meuse-Argonne. An examination of the journals, diaries, and letters that cover the pilgrimages show that at the time of the trips, the women wrote little about their dead sons and husbands. Instead, they wrote almost entirely about the tourist aspects of their trips, including dinner receptions, room furnishings, tea parties, attractions, and their amusing reactions to the French culture. Likely, with over 10 years of time having passed since their sons and husbands had died, their loss had been accepted and their grief had waned. For military hosts, the early concerns about hysterical reactions from the pilgrims never came to pass. Current travelers through the Great War battle areas will see museums, monuments, memorials that commemorate the service of the soldiers in the war. And the cemeteries and ossuaries of various nations hold the remains of known and unknown combatants who gave their lives. Walking through the rows of grave markers and reading the lists of names of the missing on the walls of the memorials and ossuaries provides an understanding of the costs of the war and a greater appreciation for the men and women who have served and given their lives for the cause. Even 100 years later, the search continues to recover the remains of the missing. A recent example made possible by global warming is the recovering of the remains of Austrian soldiers who had been engulfed in deep snow and ice on the mountaintops in Italy. Now, the following profiles some of the Allied and Central Power cemeteries, memorials, and monuments that dot the landscape in areas of battle. And of course, you probably know that the Menin Gate, they hold a ceremony there every day, and it's been held there every day since the war, except for World War II. And we had the great pleasure of participating in that during our first battlefield tour. The Thiepval Memorial is another one that is quite outstanding. It contains the names of 72,000 members of British and South African armies that fought in the Somme from 1915 through 1918. And of course, the Douaumont Cemetery. It's the largest in Europe, and it has approximately 230,000 dead. French dead are buried there. And the ossuary holds the bodies of 130,000 unidentified combatants. That's French and German that fought in that area. And you can look through the windows and see the bones. This was in Italy. You can see that instead of the typical grave marker, they're using posts to identify the dead. And you can see the difference between, this is in Gallipoli, you can see the differences between the British and the French, where the British are more garden-like and with flowers. The French are more in tune with the topography of the area. German cemeteries, they're less spectacular. They're more reserved. The 57th Infantry of the Turkish army was completely wiped out during the war. It's kind of interesting that Mustafa Kemal, who was their commander, said, "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die. In the time which passes until we die, other troops and commanders will take our place." In total, they suffered 2,500 killed and 1,000 missing in action. Today, there is no unit given the name of the 57th with respect to in respect for the losses they incurred. Here at the Helles Memorial, I want to also talk about kind of a personal thing that went on. When we were there in Gallipoli, we went to the Helles Memorial, and you can see in the right side there, Clive is pointing to a name. It's his great uncle. And then as we went down to the beach, he laid the little items that reflect his uncle on the sand where his uncle would have come ashore. And then we went up into the hillside, and he laid them again where his uncle would have engaged the battle. And at that point, he took out a little flask, and we all celebrated or commemorated his uncle's loss. But there's an interesting thing about this. The unit has been, let me see, it's the 1st of the 5th. And it has been captured in the movie All the King's Men. It's a story about the lost Sandrigans from Britain. And there was a myth about them actually being lost. And here's one of my favorites that also from Gallipoli after the war. And Mustafa Kemal was was the president of Turkey and went by the name Ataturk at that point. But he was telling the people that had lost their sons on Gallipoli, he said, "Mothers, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now in peace. After losing their lives, they have become our sons as well." And of course, these are photos of the tombs of the unknown soldiers. You can see London, Canada, Belgium. France, Italy, and the American. Then we get into American remembrances. And of course, the first of those that recognize the contributions of our men during the war was the Armistice Day. Armistice Day recognizing all soldiers that served, and that has become Veterans Day. And then for the recognition for those that have died, also starting in the Decoration Day, I think began in the 1800s. And it has since been renamed Memorial Day, but those are the days when we honor the dead. And you can see Arlington has the bodies of about 400,000 servicemen. And of course, our own pride and joy, the National Museum. And the museum that will be completed by 2024. And then you can see here where the memorials, the cemeteries, and the monuments are located in Europe and in Britain.
Jerry, thank you very much. That was outstanding. There's a lot of material there.